and welcome to the second episode of the Comprehensible Podcast. If it's your birthday today, then happy birthday. If it's your husband's or your wife's or your mum's or your dad's birthday, then tell them Dan said happy birthday. And if it's your dog's birthday, then if you just got married or engaged, then congratulations. If you just had a baby, then also congrats. And also happy birthday to the baby. If you're Korean, then 안녕하세요. If you're French, then bonjour. If I've ever stepped on your foot at a crowded train station, then I'm very sorry. And if I've ever beaten you in business, then them's the breaks, kiddo. Although, really, there's very slim chance that I've ever beaten you in business, if I'm honest. Anyway, this episode is going to be a bit about Korea and living in Korea. As I mentioned in the last episode, I've been living in Korea for the last 15 years. I'm married, no kids. I came here in 2008, just at the tail end of summer. I had terrible jet lag for about the first 3 years. Well, it felt like 3 years at the time. Actually, it was about a week or two, which is long enough. And I didn't get more than about an hour or two of sleep per night for all of that time. And most of that was during the day while I was at work. I didn't find anywhere to buy coffee for the first 3 or 4 days either, which made things even worse. When I first got here, there weren't really any coffee shops. Which you'll find difficult to believe if you know anything about Korea now, but it's true. I live in quite a small city in a rural area, so I don't know, maybe Seoul had more coffee shops. But certainly things have changed a lot here, just in the decade and a half that I've been here. So I spent like the best part of 2 days traveling to Korea. Took 3 flights, including a layover in Hong Kong and an internal flight from the international airport to the local one. I got in at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and my new manager picked me up at the airport, took me to my new apartment to drop my stuff off, and then told me to get back in the car and come to work my 8-hour shift until 10:30 p.m. Well, that surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. Mind you, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody told me the same story today. Academy jobs in Korea are not terribly hard work. And honestly, foreign teachers have it much easier than Korean teachers. But I guess the owners do like to get their money's worth out of you. Anyway, it was quite an uncomfortable day. I was really tired. I'd been looking forward to chilling out for the day before starting. And I hadn't planned any lessons or anything, so I was having to think pretty quickly. Actually, I probably wasn't thinking particularly quickly. Anyway, as I said before, I had terrible jet lag. Korea is 9 hours ahead of England, so my body clock was all messed up. And I just lay awake all night and then dragged myself out of bed when the sun started streaming through the windows. I had no coffee, so I drank some water instead. Not the same. And then I went about planning my day's classes. When I finished that, I went out to explore my new neighborhood. At lunchtime, I went into a restaurant near my apartment. I'd been studying some Korean for a couple of months before I left England. But I sure as heck couldn't read this menu at this restaurant. And so I just crossed myself, called the waitress over and pointed at something. 5 minutes later, she brought back a plate of chopped up raw fish and vegetables and a serving bowl full of broth. She put the fish on the table and the broth on the portable gas stove, and then she left. Now, this is not much of a puzzle, really, but it was a little surprising, as I'd never encountered such a situation before. I think every time that I had ever bought food in a restaurant until that point, they'd cooked the food first and then brought it to the table. So this was quite unexpected. And although it didn't feel like an IQ test exactly, it certainly did feel like some kind of a challenge. So I guess those were my first few culture shocks. But I did my BSc in anthropology and spent 3 years of my life doing nothing but reading about anthropologists turning up in the middle of a jungle somewhere and living in a tent among nearly naked tribespeople who hunted their food with blowpipes and had axe fights at dawn. So I guess my experience of distant shores was relatively mild. But honestly, it's quite amazing how quickly you can get used to a new situation. I originally intended to stay in Korea for a year before moving on elsewhere. And I imagined my whole time here to have the exotic feel of a wild adventure to it. But after a couple of weeks, everything just seemed normal. Things were different to in England, but they didn't feel all that different, really. But like I say, there are differences. One big one is obviously the language. The language is not only different because it uses different words in a different order, but because the Korean hierarchical culture is baked into it. Korean culture emphasizes social hierarchy much more than in English-speaking cultures or Western cultures in general, I guess. The most prominent and pervasive hierarchy is age. Koreans use different words for older and younger siblings, and even for uncles and aunts of different ages. 친구, the Korean word that is normally translated as friend in English, is not really the equivalent of friend. It's really closer to meaning a person of the same age. You can't have a 친구 from a different generation. You have to conjugate verbs differently and use different words for people younger or older than you. So the most prominent and pervasive example of this is putting the suffix yo at the end of all your sentences to show respect when you are speaking to somebody older than you. You should also use this with people the same age as you if you don't know them very well. But if they're older than you, then you should do it however well you know them. Although this is not normally required for family members nowadays. At work as well, staff members have to use respectful language to their managers and directors and what have you. While it's not necessary for the managers and directors to use the same respectful language when speaking back. I think this is probably one of the most difficult things for Westerners living in Korea to get used to. It certainly is for me. In fact, I think it's probably the one thing that I really struggle with after 15 years of living here. Most other respects of Korean culture are just simply a case of doing things a little differently and seem pretty much normal after a decade and a half. Another thing that I probably would struggle with if foreigners were not somewhat shielded from it is the work culture in Korea. Koreans work long hours, have few holidays, and a lot is demanded of them. In offices, general staff are not supposed to leave the office before the manager. And everywhere, workloads are quite heavy. On top of this, workers are often expected to go out eating and drinking with colleagues a couple of times a week. So work life can be kind of all-consuming. But Korea is a pretty peaceful culture, despite all the bullhorns and tannoys everywhere. And people are pretty laid back generally and friendly, which I like a lot. Another great thing about living in Korea is that the whole thing is just mountains, and cities are built around the mountains wherever there's space. I say mountains because this is how the word is usually translated into English, but really they're big wooded hills. Anyway, whatever you call them, they're wonderful and they're everywhere. So you always have a place to go to enjoy the trees and nature nearby, even in the middle of a city. In the place where I live, there's one about 5 minutes walk away, if that. I go hiking there most days, and that's really good for the soul. And what's more, there's a river on the other side of the mountain, and they've made the whole area into a kind of park that looks like kind of like a Sunday on La Grande Jatte. They have exercise machines on the mountain. So I walk up and around the mountain, through the woods, do some pull-ups and stuff, and then go down the other side of the mountain and walk along the river. It's so nice. In fact, I might go and do that now. It's spring here, and the weather is just perfect. The summer gets too hot and really humid. It's very uncomfortable, actually. But the spring is amazing. It's sunny and warm nearly every day, and not humid at all at the moment. So yeah, that's it. I'll probably talk more about living in Korea another time. There's plenty to say about that, I guess. If there's anything that you would specifically like to know, then leave a comment and I'll probably say something about it in the next one. All right, so until next time, keep on trucking.